Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So we're going to look at what in logic we call the square of opposition, and we will specifically look at traditional square of opposition, or a square of opposition in Aristotelian logic. Modern logicians don't accept a square of opposition as it is. But with some conditions, square of opposition still holds in its traditional sense. So that's why we are going to look at it, and we are also interested in traditional square of opposition at this point, because some of the other stuff we are doing requires understanding this terminology. That's why Ghazali, when he said that we can't trust someone knowledge if he doesn't know logic, that is the Aristotelian logic, as developed by Muslim logicians. One of the reasons he said that was that it is hard to understand terminology in different Islamic disciplines without knowing the terminology and the concept of traditional Aristotelian logic. So that's why I wanted to go through this traditional square of opposition. Okay. So the opposition we are talking about is opposition among different types of propositions. And propositions are basically statements of certain types. So the word for logic the word for statements in logic is proposition. In grammar, for example, we would say sentences and so forth. So there are subtle differences. That's why we stick with the term propositions. But just to give you an idea what we are talking about. So when we're talking about opposition, we are talking about opposition between or among different types of propositions. But in Aristotelian or classical logic, we deal with only particular types of propositions. And those type of propositions which we call categorical propositions. So Aristotle's logic, his syllogism, much of his syllogism mostly deal with categorical propositions. That's why it's also known as categorical syllogism. And syllogism is just a particular type of argument. Don't need to worry about it at this point. In Arabic we call, in Muslim Islamic logic, we call it qiyas. Not Islamic logic, but like Muslim, Aristotle's logic as developed by Muslims. So we only deal with categorical proposition, and categorical propositions are those propositions which are about classes of things. The classes in Greek language, classes and categories are basically same things in our usage. Although if you study Kant, for example, and the related things are concepts as well. So what I meant was concept and categories are the same things basically. In our context, although if you study Kant's philosophy, he differentiates between categories and concepts. But that distinction is not relevant for us here. So categorical propositions are those propositions which are about class of things. So for example, we talk about animals, so class of animals, or dogs, class of dogs, or white things, so class of the color white, or any classes, for example, class of all white people, for example, black people, capitalists, industrialists. These are all classes. So Aristotle's categorical propositions are about classes, or at least if they are not in the form of classes, we are able to convert them to statements about classes. And that's why Aristotelian logic can be, through Venn diagram, we can portray these statements in terms of sets. So all animals are living beings, for example. So there are two classes we are talking about here, and the class of all animals and class of all living beings. So what he's saying is set of class of all animals is subset of class of all living being, subset of the set of all living beings, for example. Anyway, so the first thing is that this we're talking about categorical, so categorical propositions only. Positions only. The second thing is that those categorical propositions we are talking about have two things. They have quality and they have quantity. The type of qualities this logic, Aristotelian logic, talks about is the quality of the proposition being affirmative or negative. So these are two qualities of these propositions: affirmative or negative. And as far as quantity is concerned, we're talking about either universal or particular. If the claim is about all members of the class, then it is universal. And if it is about the sum members of the class, then it is a particular. So when we study these relationship between these propositions, we are dealing with only categorical propositions. Those are the propositions with quality, two types of quality, affirmative or negative, and they have two types of quantities, universal and particular. So we don't deal with propositions which are neither universal nor particular, that is, the specific propositions. And if propositions are not in their form, not about universal and particular, and we are able to convert them to universal and particular proposition, then it's fine. But otherwise, we don't deal with those propositions in categorical or Aristotelian or classical logic. Okay, and hence we don't study them in a square of oppositions. Okay, now the fourth thing is the fourth condition of the propositions we are going to study. The relationship between in this square of opposition is that their subject and predicate must be the same. So these are the four conditions, or the four prerequisites for the type of propositions which we are going to look at in the square of opposition, or we do study relationship between in the square of opposition. If we take into account all these four conditions we have set up, then we get only four types of propositions or statement. So we get categorical propositions, which is universal, that's its quantity, but affirmative. The second one would be proposition categorical proposition, which is universal but negatives. The third one would be categorical proposition, which is particular but positive. And this one is particular negative. So we get four types of propositions. This one we call A. By A we mean a universal proposition which is affirmative. By E we mean a universal proposition which is negative. By I we mean a particular proposition which is positive. By O we mean particular proposition which is negative. And as we said, subject and predicates are the same in all these propositions. So if I call subject S and predicate P, then we can get following representation of these propositions. So we get A, that is its name, and its skeleton or structure is, you can say every or you can say all, that's same thing. Every S is P. So every S is P, or all S is P, all S are P. This is universal affirmative. The second one is I. Its form would, E. Its form would be E. Its form would be no S is P. And the third one is I, and this would be some S is P. And then we have fourth one, that's O, and that is some S is not P. So this is a form because or structure of these propositions, because we can put anything in place of S and P as long as we consistently put the same thing for S and same thing for P, because we are trying to study the relationship between these four. So this one is universal affirmative, this is universal negative, this is particular affirmative, that is particular negative. So these are four categorical propositions, and the square of opposition studies the relationship between them, so to speak. So when we study the relationship between these four types of propositions, we find that A and O are contradictory to each other. I'll explain their meaning in a minute. Contradictory to each other. And we also find that E and I are also contradictory to each other. That's the first relationship of contradiction, which occurs between universal affirmative and particular negative, and universal negative and particular affirmative. this is the strongest of the opposition. So the relationships are all oppositional in here, but the contradiction is the strongest of opposition in a sense, in a manner, or in a sense, which we will look at in a minute. And the second opposition, which is not as strong as contradiction, but still strong, is called contrariness, or contrary. Two statements are contrary. So which one are contrary? Universal propositions are contrary to each other. So contraries are A and E are contraries to each other. So universal affirmative is contrary to universal negative, and universal negative is contrary to. And the third relationship is between particular affirmative and particular negative. They are contrary to each other. So particular affirmative is subcontrary to each other. So subcontrary. So these are contraries. So first is contradiction, second is contrary, third is subcontrary. So particular affirmative and particular negative are subcontrary to each other. So particular affirmative is subcontrary to particular negative, and particular negative is subcontrary to particular affirmative. So that's the third one. So contradiction, contrary, subcontrary. And the last relationship is the relationship of subalternation. So every particular statement is subaltern of its corresponding universal statement. So the relationship between universal affirmative and universal particular affirmative, or this one, particular affirmative, is that of subalternation. And we will say that PA is subaltern of UA. Similarly, PN is subaltern of UN. And in other words, the relationship between UA and PA is that of subalternation, and the relationship between UN and PN is that of subalternation, or in other words, PA is subaltern of UA, or UA is superaltern of PA, or UN is superaltern of PN, and OPN is subaltern of UN. They're same way of thinking. So the relationship between the universal statement and their corresponding particular statement is that of subalternation. And this is the relationship of implication, as we will see. Okay, so we have these four relationships: contradiction, that's the name of the relationship. The statements are contradictories. Then the statements are contraries. Three subcontractories. And the fourth, they are subaltern or subaltern, depending on which side you're looking from. So this would be contradiction, contrariness, subcontrariness, subaltern, alternation. Okay, now we need to know what they mean. These three in the language, in a normal language, in everyday language, they almost mean the same thing. Contradiction, contrary. I mean, we don't use subcontrary in that sense, but contradiction and contrary mean the same thing. But in logical terminology, they mean slightly different things. So, what does contradiction mean? Contradiction. So two statements. So contradiction is between propositions. So two statements are contradictory if and only if they both, that's why they are very strong. This is the strongest relation. They both can not be true so they can't both be true. And they can't both be false. So they can't both be true. So they can't both be true and they can't both be false. So universal affirmative and particular negative are contradictories. So they can't both be true and they can't both be false. One of them must be true and the other must be false. So the truthhood of one implies the falsehood of the other. Similarly, a universal negative and particular affirmative are contradictories of each other. That is, they can't both be true and they can't both be false. That is, one of them must be true or false, and the truth of one would imply the falsehood of the other. So let us take the example of the contradictory statements we have. So as we said, A and E are, A and O are contradictory to each other. O are contradictory to each other, and then E and I are contradictory to each other. So if let's just focus on this as an example. So if we take, so this is A is like all S is P, and O is some S is not P. Yeah, so just choose some subject and predicate and keep them same. So if we say, let's say S is judges and P is lawyers, so then we get all judges are lawyers. And then we get some judges are not lawyers. So these statements are opposed to each other both in quality and quantity. That one of them is positive and universal, the other is negative and the other is particular negatives. So if all judges are lawyers, then some judges are not lawyers. Must be false. If all judges are lawyers is true, then this must be false. And if all judges are lawyers is false, then some judges are not lawyers must be true. So exactly one is true and exactly one is false. They can't both be true. They can't both be false. Let's take another example of this. So contradictories. So A and O are contradictories. So we just looked at one example. Just take another example. All capitalists, for example, are industrialists. And its corresponding O proposition is sum. So you change the quantity and then you change the quality and keep these same. Some capitalists are not industrialists. So they can't both be true, they can't both be false. If one is true, the other must be false. If one is false, the other must be true, if they are contradictories. So all capitalists are industrialists. If that is true, then some capitalists are not industrialists, obviously false. And if all capitalists are industrialists is false, then some capitalists are not industrialists, obviously true. So as a matter of fact, all capitalists are industrialists is false. So that's mean this must be true. So knowing that they are contradictories, we can make immediate inferences. So this is false and they are contradictory, we know that, then we know that the other one is true. Okay, so these were the examples of A and O. Now let us take example of E and I. They are both contradictories as well. Okay, so E and I are contradictories to each other, that they can't both be true and they can't both be false. So let's take an example of E proposition. So if we say no politicians are honest, meaning honest persons. So that's the E. And its corresponding I would be, you just change no to sum, so universal. And so some politicians are honest. So they are contradictory to each other. They are contradictories, meaning that they can't both be true. So if this is true, then this can't be true. It must be false. And if this is false, then this can't be false. That is, it must be true. So the matter of fact, no politicians are honest if it is true. Then some politicians are honest, obviously, is false. That can't be true. And if we assume that no politicians are honest is false, then some politicians are honest can't be false. It must be true. As a matter of fact, no politicians are honest in false. So this must be true. Okay, so these are contradictories, and this is the strongest relationship in this square of oppositions, and this holds between E and I and A and O. So two propositions which are which have different quantity and also different qualities, they are contradictories to each other, which are A and O and E and I. Okay, and knowing this, and if we know that one proposition is E or A, and if we know if it is false and true, then we can make an immediate inference about I or O and vice versa. So I think this has gone too long already, so I'll just stop here and we'll do the rest, contraries and subcontraries and subalternation, and a bit of reflection on this in the next video, inshallah.